How did the insult thing start?
Well, to condense it, to be very honest, the insult thing started out of lack of having an act. And suddenly I leaned down and said, "Sir, I'm getting fed up with you."
Don Rickles built his career by tearing people apart with laughter. No star was too powerful, no audience member too ordinary. Everyone was fair game for his sharp tongue. And yet, behind the curtain of comedy, there was one person who got under his skin in a way no joke could fix. Unlike Sinatra, Carson, or Reagan, this man wasn't charmed by Rickles' insults. He didn't laugh, he didn't flinch, he didn't play along. And for Rickles, that silence became unforgettable. So, who was it? The clash with Denzel Washington. Don Rickles was famous for sparing no one. Politicians, world leaders, celebrities, even his closest friends. Everyone became a target the moment he opened his mouth. Yet nearly everyone loved him for it. His insults didn't burn bridges, they built them. Even Frank Sinatra, the most feared man in Hollywood, embraced Rickles after being roasted. That was Rickles' magic. He could sting you with words and leave you laughing. But there was one man he could never win over. One man whose presence seemed to unravel everything Rickles thrived on. That man was Denzel Washington. To understand why Washington stood out, you have to look at Rickles' style. His comedy was built on reaction. He needed eye contact, smirks, nervous laughter, or playful pushback. The insult was just the spark. The real payoff came from the shared acknowledgement that it was all in fun. Without that exchange, the insult just hung in the air. And with Washington, there was nothing. No smirk, no chuckle, no indulgence. Just that piercing, stoic gaze. Washington carried himself with a nearly unshakable seriousness. On screen, he radiated authority. Off screen, he projected the same intensity. Dignified, focused, untouchable. For Rickles, it was like trying to tell jokes to a monument, where Sinatra played along, where Carson cracked up, where even presidents leaned into the roast. Washington gave him silence. And silence, to a comedian like Rickles, was poison. Insiders say Rickles tried repeatedly to get Washington to crack. At events, in green rooms, even during chance encounters, he'd launch his sharpest barbs. "Denzel, loosen up. You're making Mount Rushmore look like it's in motion," he once quipped. But Washington's face never budged. For Rickles, this wasn't just frustrating, it was infuriating. His career had been built on breaking people down, only to rebuild them with laughter. Washington denied him that. In the course of time, what had once begun as the vexation of a professional became increasingly acutely personal. While Rickles reserved his mind's little sharpness for public dispersers or his critics, a harsher edge croaked out whenever the name Washington was mentioned. Friends who knew the change could perceive it. There was not the casual lethality that Rickles administered to Sinatra, Eastwood, or Reagan, but something much sharper and dismissive. It was laced with something closer to genuine dislike. Here was a person who created an entire identity, not taking things too personally, and who ended up being stuck under Washington's skin. Ironically, Washington never tried to provoke Rickles. He was simply being himself, serious, respectful, private. But to Rickles, that sounded like rejection. Not of the jokes, but of him, which cut deeper than almost any affront he had ever delivered. For him, comedy is connection. Through it, he crossed distances, penetrated the ego of Hollywood, and made strangers into friends. When Washington declined that invitation, Rickles sensed a breach of the sacred rules of comedy. It became the only fly in the ointment of an otherwise almost superhuman record. Rickles could brag about getting Sinatra to laugh and insulting Reagan to his face, or leaving Johnny Carson doubled over. However, he couldn't brag about ever cracking Denzel Washington. And for one who lived for such victories, that silence stung more than admitted. Ultimately, the clash revealed as much about Rickles as it did Washington. Washington's calm demeanor multiplied by Washington was part of the reason that he approached such respect. But where Rickles fell short in reaching Washington emphasized that so much of his comedy depended on the use of that enacted laughter. Without that, the insults didn't sound like victories. They sounded more like losses. And yet, Rickles never let that single frustration define him. Because even as he sparred with Hollywood's untouchables, he was also building something just as powerful, a private life filled with love, loss, and family loyalty that would shape his final decades. The making of Mr. Warmth. Before Don Rickles became the man who could bring presidents, movie stars, and mob bosses to tears of laughter, he was just a kid from Queens with a quick tongue and restless ambition. Born Donald J. Rickles on May 8, 1926, in Jackson Heights, New York, he grew up in a modest Jewish household. His father, Max, worked as an insurance agent, while his mother, Etta, devoted herself to raising Don. Etta, in particular, played a central role in shaping his personality. She encouraged him to think beyond their cramped apartment, nurturing the spark that would later ignite his career. As a boy, Rickles was sharp, curious, and impatient with boundaries. He discovered early on that humor earned him more attention than anything else. Wisecracks in class often got him in trouble, but they also made him popular with classmates who admired his lightning wit. Even then, Rickles showed flashes of the sarcastic genius that would define him. His mother doted on him, recognizing that his humor wasn't mere silliness, it was a defense mechanism, a survival tool in a neighborhood where quick thinking could be as valuable as strength. After high school, Rickles set his sights on acting. He enrolled at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York, determined to be taken seriously as a performer. His dream was Broadway, maybe even Hollywood dramas, with Shakespeare and prestige roles in his future. Comedy wasn't the plan. But during early stage work, Rickles often filled awkward pauses with ad-libbed quips. To his surprise, audiences laughed harder at those improvised moments than at the actual script. Slowly, he realized fate was pulling him toward comedy, even as he clung to the dream of acting. World War II interrupted everything. Rickles enlisted in the U.S. Navy, serving as a seaman on the USS Cyrene in the Pacific. The sea created a rough man out of him, but it also awakened in him the appreciation for absurdity. In perilous situations, he found that joking with fellow sailors relieved their tension and fostered a peculiar sense of camaraderie. They laughed together. His comments became a unifying force rather than an insult. That lesson stayed with him for life. With the end of the war, Rickles came back to New York, ready to attempt a career in show business. Acting jobs were almost non-existent, so he invaded the New York nightclubs. Early on, his act integrated a dramatic monologue with the occasional wisecrack. The gimmick bombed, and one night, responding to a heckler who asked for it, Rickles lobbed a nasty wisecrack, and the crowd roared with laughter. That was the moment he understood he was made for this. The audiences didn't want somebody reading rehearsed lines. They wanted that precise, cutting, unscripted voice that reached right through them. By the early 1950s, Rickles had made a transition into insult comedy, a genre that was almost non-existent at that time. He did not employ setups or punchlines. He simply walked onto the stage, surveyed the crowd, and then went straight for the jugular. He made fun of people's haircuts, mocked their dresses, and sniped at anyone in sight. No one was spared, politicians, celebrities, or ordinary people. Yet somehow, his barbs felt affectionate rather than mean. Oddly, people came out of the shows feeling flattered by being targeted. Such balance became his trademark, roasting slowly without alienation. Very soon, it became something like Rickles is a popular insult comic, going around being talented and unpredictable. He was one of the most unpredictable, harrowing, and, at times, uncomfortable shows, but he was never boring. Regular bookings at the venues would be sufficient for the club and pack audiences to see something never seen anywhere else. It was during the above time that Rickles would earn the largely fun-loving title that would follow him the rest of his days, Mr. Warmth. The ironic title was supposed to encapsulate, in a sense, the paradox of his act, which, according to audiences, was often all-in-all merciless on stage. However, under that aversion, audiences perceived no intent of malice, but rather the need for bonding through hysterical laughter, and often gave it. He fired shots at people because he liked them. And the more vicious the shot, the more people loved it. But while nightclub crowds loved his fearlessness, Hollywood was still a bigger mountain to climb. And it would take one unlikely friendship with none other than Frank Sinatra to push Don Rickles into the national spotlight. Breaking into Hollywood. By the mid-1950s, Don Rickles had carved out his identity as the man who said what no one else dared. Nightclubs along the East Coast buzzed about the comedian who roasted audiences without mercy. But as much as he thrived in smoky lounges, Hollywood still felt distant. Rickles wanted more than applause from late-night crowds. He wanted the big stage, the spotlight, and the chance to stand shoulder to shoulder with America's biggest entertainers. The turning point came from the unlikeliest source, Frank Sinatra. In mid-20th century America, Sinatra wasn't just a singer, he was the celebrity, a cultural force whose approval could open every door in Hollywood. For most comedians, the idea of insulting Sinatra was unthinkable, even a career-ending move. But when Sinatra attended one of Rickles' shows in Miami, Don didn't hesitate. Looking directly at him, he cracked, "Make yourself at home, Frank. Hit somebody." The audience froze. Then Sinatra roared with laughter. That single moment changed Rickles' career. Sinatra loved him, respected his guts, and admired his nerve. From that night on, Sinatra became Rickles' greatest supporter, bringing him to shows, introducing him to celebrities, and defending him against critics who called his act too abrasive. Sinatra's approval became Rickles' passport into Hollywood's inner circle. Soon, Rickles was appearing regularly on national television, most memorably on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. Carson adored him because he was unpredictable. While most guests rehearsed stories, Rickles walked on stage and created chaos, roasting Carson, mocking the band, and even teasing the audience at home. It was risky, but it worked. Ratings spiked whenever Rickles appeared, turning him into more than a nightclub act. He was becoming a household name. Perhaps the television variety shows were a further expansion of his reach. Rickles was the life of practically every show. His rapid-fire insults on Dean Martin's celebrity roasts made him come alive for each telecast. Stars such as Ronald Reagan, Bob Hope, and Sinatra himself, he decided to blow to smithereens as he insulted them. They laughed even more because of his sweet talking. To be roasted by Don Rickles was no disgrace. It was considered a badge of honor, evidence you were in the company of laughter in Hollywood. But Rickles wouldn't give up dreaming about acting. It was with Sinatra's help that he started getting parts in motion pictures. In 1958, Rickles starred with Clark Gable and Burt Lancaster in Run Silent, Run Deep, which established him as an actor in dramatic roles as well as comedies. Later that year, he matched wits with Clint Eastwood in the more comedic role in Kelly's Heroes, 1970. By the mid-70s, he even had a comedy series on the air under his name, CPO Sharkey, where he played a Navy officer whose bark and sarcasm fit him perfectly. Yet, to many, it seemed impossible to categorize him. Rickles was unscripted, dangerous, even uncomfortably raw, while most audiences enjoyed comedy as scripted and safe in that golden age. Yet, to make him honest, he made it irreplaceable. In the town of big egos and finesse, Rickles was the air relief valve. The stars knew he would put them in proportion and be shocked and awed by him. By the end of the 1970s, Rickles was no longer just a nightclub sensation. He was as much a television regular and film actor as any of America's most talked-about comedians. While Sinatra had left the doors ajar, Rickles kicked them wide open in the fearless style and refusal to do things by someone else's rules. Yet, for all his Hollywood success, Rickles' most important act wasn't on stage or screen. It was in his personal life, and meeting Barbara would prove to be the one role that kept him grounded through it all. Family, love, and loss. For a man who made his name calling others hockey puck and gleefully tearing into celebrities on stage, Don Rickles' private life couldn't have been more different. Behind the biting wit was someone who craved stability, warmth, and loyalty. He found all of that in Barbara Sklar, the woman who became not only his wife, but the anchor of his life. Rickles was already in his late 30s when he met Barbara, unusually late for a man of his generation to marry. Friends teased him about being a lifelong bachelor, convinced his sharp tongue had scared off romance. But Barbara was different. She wasn't dazzled by his fame, nor charmed by his endless wisecracks. In fact, Rickles admitted one of the things that drew him in was that she didn't laugh at his jokes when they first met. For a man used to commanding a room with laughter, her refusal intrigued him. In 1965, Don and Barbara married. Unlike the chaos of his career, their marriage was rooted in steadiness. Friends saw it immediately. Barbara grounded Don. She gave him normalcy, a reminder that beyond Hollywood lights was a family waiting at home. Together, they had 2 children, Mindy and Larry, who each pursued careers in entertainment. At home, Rickles revealed a softer side. On stage, he was the merchant of venom, but with family, he was affectionate, sentimental, and fiercely protective. He spoke of Barbara with reverence, calling her his confidant and his anchor in a business notorious for inflating egos and wrecking marriages. His children, too, saw this gentler version. Mindy pursued acting, while Larry thrived behind the camera as a writer and producer. Don was immensely proud of both, often joking about their work, but never hiding his admiration. Sadly, in 2011, pneumonia took away Larry at the very young age of 41. This loss was devastating to Don and Barbara. For a man who lived his life to make people laugh, losing a child is a wound that never heals. In subsequent interviews, the wit of Rickles turned to a quiet grief at the mention of Larry. It was a reminder of the fact that underneath all the laughter, he was just another father who hurt like everyone else. Soon, Rickles had grandchildren, who added unexpected pleasures to the family. To them, he was not the roast master of Hollywood, but merely Grandpa Don. They knew him less from late-night television and more as the guy behind Mr. Potato Head in Pixar's 2 Toy Story films. Don often joked that after decades of work, the only thing his grandkids cared about was that he was a talking plastic potato. Secretly, he loved it, proof to himself that laughter, even in animated form, was timeless. For the most part, Barbara was at his side. Celebrity marriages usually don't last, or have even some shade of love in them. This was the opposite. It lasted, endured, loved, and even gave a shudder at fame. Those who visited their home were in awe of its simplicity. He may be bigger than life on stage, but at the dinner table, he is a husband and dad first. And in 2021, exactly 56 years on the same day as that wedding, Barbara was described as heart-wrenching, yet the most. Rickles contrasted even more between his public persona and his private life. As the fearless insult comic on stage who cuts down everybody, he is a dedicated husband, father, and grandfather who puts family before everything else when at home. For anyone who had the privilege of knowing him, that softer side of his life made as much of an identity as did his comedy. Yet even with a loving family and a career that spanned decades, there was one place where Rickles' humor truly became legend: the celebrity roasts, where his sharp tongue created unforgettable moments and lasting grudges. The legend reinvented. By the 1970s, Don Rickles was no longer just another nightclub act. He was a fixture of American pop culture. What began as a quirky approach to stand-up had evolved into an entire comedic movement, insult comedy, and Rickles stood alone at its peak. What made him remarkable wasn't just the act itself, but the way he reinvented his legend across decades, audiences, and platforms. Television quickly became Rickles' playground. After his breakout roasting Frank Sinatra and dazzling Johnny Carson, he became a Tonight Show staple. Carson loved him because he was unpredictable. While other comedians rehearsed tight sets, Rickles thrived on chaos. He would storm the stage, mock the host, insult the band, take shots at celebrities in the crowd, and leave Carson doubled over. Those appearances became must-see TV, proving Rickles could dominate the living room as easily as the Vegas stage. The Dean Martin celebrity roasts elevated him further. These prime-time specials gathered Hollywood's biggest names: actors, politicians, athletes, even Ronald Reagan, and Rickles was always the centerpiece. His barbs were sharper than anyone's, but his delivery softened the sting. To be roasted by Rickles was almost a badge of honor, a sign of inclusion in Hollywood's inner circle of laughter. His act wasn't cruelty, it was recognition, wielded with precision. Rickles also proved himself a versatile actor. His dramatic turn in Run Silent, Run Deep, 1958, showed he could hold his own with Clark Gable and Burt Lancaster. In Kelly's Heroes, 1970, he leaned into comedy opposite Clint Eastwood. By the mid-70s, he even starred in his own sitcom, CPO Sharky, playing a Navy officer barking orders at misfit recruits. The show wasn't a long-running hit, but it cemented him as more than a club act. He was a television star. As comedy styles changed throughout the decades of the 1980s and 1990s, Rickles decided not to compromise and remain au courant. While others were softening their acts, Rickles was only getting harder. He relentlessly toured to packed houses in Las Vegas and Atlantic City, where audiences came not just for the jokes, but for the chance to see a true legend who had never catered to political correctness. His audience understood that his insults stemmed from affection and were merely a game. The most astonishing reinvention was the 1990s casting by Pixar of Mr. Potato Head in Toy Story. Suddenly, the kids who had never known Sinatra or Carson had Rickles' voice in their hearts. The sarcasm and wisecracking style he infused into the character made it unforgettable. He reprised the role in every sequel. Rickles would joke that after 50 years of work, his legacy would be of a plastic potato, but he loved it. It only proved that his comedy could cut across generations. In the 2000s, Rickles was more than a comedian. Indeed, he was something of a cultural institution. Documentaries, tributes, and specials celebrated the longevity of the performer, and even younger comics, including Chris Rock, Jerry Seinfeld, and David Letterman, acclaimed him as an originator of courageous comedy. The year of its airing, the project won an Emmy in 2008 for Mr. Warmth, the Don Rickles Project, a commemoration well then due in the annals of comedy history. He would go through every reinvention. Yet, the one thing that remained unchanged: authenticity, the greatest part of Rickles' act. In his performance, he never diluted anything, never impersonate another individual, and never felt bad about his art. Compromise indeed makes him timeless, controversial, and finally unforgettable. But even legends have limits, and for Don Rickles, there was one actor whose unshakable seriousness turned his usual comedy routine into something far more personal. Final years and farewell. For a man who built his legacy on chaos, laughter, and razor-sharp wit, Don Rickles' final years were surprisingly calm. After decades of touring, roasting, and sparring with Hollywood's elite, he gradually shifted into a quieter phase of life. He still performed into his 80s, but the pace slowed. The smoky nightclubs, late-night talk shows, and Vegas residencies that once defined him gave way to interviews, smaller appearances, and more time with his family. For the Merchant of Venom, his twilight years were marked less by bitterness than reflection. One of the biggest surprises of Rickles' late career was how a new generation discovered him, not through roasts or nightclubs, but through Pixar. His role as Mr. Potato Head in the Toy Story films immortalized him in a way few predicted. Children who had never heard of Sinatra or Carson knew him instantly as the sarcastic Spud with the funny voice. Rickles liked to joke that decades of comedy had been overshadowed by a talking plastic potato. But he was proud of it, because it meant his humor had transcended time. Offstage, Rickles leaned more on his family. His marriage to Barbara, lasting over 50 years, became the bedrock of his later life. Friends often remarked on how grounded she kept him, especially as his health began to decline. Together, they endured triumphs, tragedies, and the unimaginable loss of their son Larry. That grief never left them, but bound them in ways words rarely could. In his grandchildren, Rickles found new joy. They didn't care about the roast master or Vegas legend. To them, he was simply Grandpa Don. Rickles began losing the battle to time. By the late 1980s, ill health plagued him. Kidney troubles weakened him further, yet he continued to give interviews and make television cameos. His wit remained razor-sharp, even as the body began to slow. At one of his last public appearances, Rickles was asked about retirement. He replied, "Retire? To do what? Sit home and stare at the walls? My wife won't let me. She likes me out of the house." It was typical Rickles, using humor to deflect from weakness, reminding the world that laughter was his language until the end. Don Rickles died on April 6, 2017, at his home in Century City, Los Angeles, at the age of 90. Causes: kidney failure. The death signified an end of an era in comedy, the passing away of the last of the great links to the generation that built modern American humor on nightclub stages and live television. Rising tributes poured in from all corners: comedians, actors, directors, and politicians. Many recalled not just his fearless, dark-humored insults, but also the love behind them. He finally took rest at the Mount Sinai Memorial Park in Los Angeles, like so many of the most revered Hollywood folks. It is here that once the man who laughed at presidents made squirming celebrities find peace among the quiet hills. It became a place of mourning for his fans, but also a place of gratitude. Gratitude for the years of laughter and for the career that demonstrated comedy could be ruthless, yet kind. Rickles' last years revealed who he was as a whole. Of course, there is the insult comic who had no respect for anyone, but there also is a husband, a father, a grandfather, and a human being who fully lived, leaving both laughter and love behind. And yet, even in death, one story lingered above the rest: the tale of the one man Don Rickles truly hated more than anyone. The legacy of laughter and loathing. When people look back at Don Rickles' career, what stands out is not only the laughter, but the fearlessness. He was the man who roasted Frank Sinatra to his face and walked away with Sinatra's friendship. He turned insult into affection, making audiences howl even as he cut them down. For decades, Hollywood's biggest names lined up to be his targets, knowing that beneath the sting was warmth and respect. Almost no one was off limits. Almost. Insiders say one man stood apart from Rickles' gallery of victims, not because Rickles avoided him, but because when he did joke about him, it felt different. That man was Denzel Washington. Unlike Sinatra, Clint Eastwood, or Ronald Reagan, Washington didn't give Rickles what he needed most: the laugh. He didn't grin, didn't play along, didn't let Rickles' barbs dent his poise. For a comic who thrived on connection, Washington's stoicism was like a locked door Rickles couldn't open. And in Rickles' world, that was more than frustrating. It was infuriating. To audiences, Rickles' irritation rarely surfaced beyond a few sharp quips, but those who knew him said the frustration was real. When Washington's name came up, Rickles' usual playful sarcasm hardened. He'd crack lines like, "The man makes Mount Rushmore look animated." Friends noticed these weren't softened with his usual wink. They were blunt. For Rickles, Washington was the one laugh he could never land. Why did it matter so much? Because comedy, for Rickles, wasn't just work. It was a connection. Every insult was a handshake in disguise. To roast someone was to welcome them into the circle of shared laughter. When Washington refused to play along, Rickles didn't just feel blocked as a performer, he felt rejected. For a man whose identity was built on making anyone laugh anywhere, Washington's silence was a wound that never quite healed. Rickles would bear that injury. Sinatra hugged him, presidents invited him, and crowds loved his humor. But Washington was still not within reach. And in the absence of laughter, Rickles contended with the most uncomfortable thing he hated the most: the memory that even top comedians do not touch everyone. But maybe that's part of Rickles' heritage too. His story was a saga of victories and the defeats he had to incur. Behind all those high-speed insults and a hyperactive personality was a real person who needed humor like others need air. When he could no longer get it from Washington or anyone else, it shook him emotionally. Still, the larger truth remains. The world will ever remain rich with Don Rickles' presence. His hatred for Washington imagination, pride, or just pure frustration was but one note in a 7-decade symphony of laughter. He sharpened the craft of comedy and made it more daring, but mostly human. An insult could also be an act of love. Rickles died in 2017, and the tributes had less to say about grudges, but celebrated the roasts, the late-night pandemonium, the potato from Toy Story. They remembered a man willing to offend everyone because he thought people would understand his heart. They mostly did. And that wraps up today's story. What do you think about Don Rickles' one true rivalry? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe for more untold stories, and ring the bell so you never miss an update. And before you go, check out the next video on your screen. We've got even more hidden stories from Hollywood waiting for you.